Hello, everybody, and welcome to School Psych Podcast. I'm Rebecca. I am a school psychologist in the state of Florida, and you will notice that I'm here on my own tonight. We're missing Rachel and Eric. It's the end of NASP, and Eric is traveling, and unfortunately, Rachel is not feeling well. So I am going to host this episode on my own, and I'm really excited to have our wonderful guest, but I will share that typically I look for your comments on all of our social media, and I'm doing a little bit of multitasking while we're in the episode broadcasting live. And tonight I probably will not do that because I will stay focused on having this conversation and learning as much as I can to share with all of you. So, but please do feel free to comment if you're logged in, if you're watching us live, comments right alongside the YouTube video, because we can even reply later or over time and keep the conversation and the discussion going. I'd love to hear all of your questions and read all of your thoughts and experiences in this topic area, because I think that it is one that is really relevant to school professionals and certainly parents and anyone who cares about kids. So now, without further ado, I'd love to introduce our wonderful guest. Natasha Daniels is a child therapist and founder of AT Parenting Survival. I just want to share a little bit before I let her introduce herself. She's got so many years of experience and things to talk about professionally. But my introduction to Natasha was on YouTube when I was a very new school psychologist, working with young people with different kinds of anxiety and just wanting to learn about how to talk to kids about anxious feelings and how to take that psychoeducation, the language of talking about anxiety and when anxiety is problematic or impactful, and make it kid friendly. And Natasha had these amazing videos on YouTube, she still does, I'm sure, talking directly to young people. And one of my favorite metaphors of hers is the lifeguard metaphor, which I'm sure I'm going to ask her to explain. But it's one that I have used ever since I've seen it, because it's just so helpful for kids understanding what can sometimes happen with anxiety and the lifeguard in our brain and having to retrain our lifeguard. And so I'm really excited for all of you to get to know Natasha. And now I'm going to hand it over to you, Natasha. Please welcome and please introduce yourself to our school site community and tell us, how did you get into this field, and where and how did that all start on YouTube? Is that the first place you started?
Yeah, I actually don't even remember. It's so scary. I don't know what order things happen. But I am, I'm an anxiety and OCD child therapist and a mom to 3 kids with anxiety and OCD. And I don't think YouTube was the first place. I actually started a blog, and so I started a website because my publisher, I wrote a book. That's kind of how it unfolded. I wrote a book, How to Parent Your Anxious Toddler,
Okay.
and they were like, you need to have a platform, and I didn't even know what that meant. So then a website, and then a podcast, then YouTube, and then quickly I moved away from toddlers and was more kids, teens, and young adults even, and then I was just all anxiety and OCD. So, and that was back in 2015. So I've been doing this for a while online.
Okay, and that makes sense. My first year was 2014, so I must have found you shortly after that.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And I remember your community started out as for toddlers, and but and I think now that you're saying it, I remember your blog, because that was really helpful as well for me. There wasn't a lot out there in that space for pediatric therapists of any kind, but let alone with specific sort of skills lessons and things like that. So I really appreciate it. And now tell us a little bit about how your community has grown, because I see that it's huge now. You have a parenting community, and you're still writing. Is that right?
Yeah, it has grown. So I think I've published 6 books. I have a book coming out next week, Crushing OCD Workbook for Kids. So that that part has grown, and I have an online community. So I have a AT parenting community, which is a like membership community where we do live classes each week. We have support group calls. It's much more intense, which I find really rewarding just to work directly with
Yeah.
parents. And the podcast and the YouTube channel are still going all this time later. Yeah.
That's amazing. And on your YouTube channel, do you still speak to separate audiences like kids themselves, parents, and clinicians as well?
Yeah, my YouTube channel, I'm speaking directly. It's not a YouTube for kids anymore. I'm
Right.
speaking to the person who's struggling. So
Right.
whether they're tweens, teens, kids,
Mm.
and young adults, but the person who's actually struggling. And then now YouTube lets you load up your podcasts on YouTube. So my podcasts are streaming on YouTube as well, but
Okay.
there's no video on that.
Okay. Wow. That's really cool. It's cool to feel like I found you at the beginning. That-
They're actually old too.
well, you and me both, but no. So tell us, what have you noticed as a therapist who specializes in anxiety and OCD? What have you noticed about presenting problems with kids, and how that has changed over time in terms of like people who are seeking help, or the understanding about anxiety and how it can impact kids' lives and day to day?
Yeah, I think there's more desire to understand it, especially like post COVID. I think there's just been more understanding of needing to focus on mental health more. I think there was also an increase in anxiety and OCD that we saw after that for so many different reasons. And so, and I think people are getting more educated on the difference between anxiety and OCD because those are really different as well, and how they're approached are different.
Right.
So we still have a long way to go, but I do feel like we're taking some baby steps. It's much better than when I was a kid. It's better than it was 10 years ago. And so we're progressing where mental health is not, and hopefully is not an embarrassing or shameful thing as we're
Right.
progressing.
Absolutely. And, working in schools, I've noticed the increase in awareness as well, and as well as the just increase in prevalence. I've noticed it in my work with kids and their parents and teachers, but also in the data, right? Like you said, since COVID, especially, but even before, probably since around 2008, 2010, we've seen like these great spikes in anxiety in general, in the experience of anxiety. And I think the number, right, is one in five kids will struggle with some type of mental health challenge. And that's a lot. So there really is such a need for strategies. So I'm wondering, in schools, as you may know, school psychologists, we don't get a lot of time, with kids, but we do try to offer in-school supports, and we see all the ways in which anxiety and OCD can impact their availability to learn and really access their education. Generally, what do you think that school psychologists, once we identify a student who may be struggling with some kind of anxiety or OCD, what are kind of first steps? What would you recommend for either working with the child directly, and also supporting teachers and parents and the child's kind of team to know about or to understand?
Yeah, it can show up so differently for every kid that it's hard to say in general.
Yeah.
I think before it even gets on the radar of the school, the number one issue with kids with anxiety and OCD is school refusal and school avoidance. And
Yeah.
so they may not even know to reach out to the school, and maybe drowning before they're even on your radar because they can't go, and they're getting, you know, they're getting pressure from the school. And
Yeah.
so I think that's the primary issue. Then there's all sorts of issues in the school environment that may have caused that or kind of add to that. But I think that's the first big thing.
Absolutely. School anxiety and school refusal also have seen such spikes in terms of numbers of students that's impacting. And Um, I've seen in the literature there's kind of a distinction between truancy and then like real school anxiety, for the as term in terms of a cause of missing school and absences. And so when we see anxiety, so different schools have lots of different strategies for supporting this, for helping kids get to school. I know that some schools that I've worked with, some districts have sort of specialized teams, BCBAs, or um, you know, people kind of who only work on school anxiety and helping kids get back into school. And they usually do some type of behavioral exposure, get gradual exposure to getting kids slowly back into a school routine. I feel like that has mixed results. Have you seen that as well? That kids are working with sort of behavioral specialists in school?
I've never seen that. That would be amazing to actually have that kind of support. And I'm seeing things globally. So I
Right.
think we have some school districts that just have so much better resources to be able to provide that kind of stuff. I've seen therapists try to do exposure to get kids incrementally back to school, which is hard when you're a therapist outside of the school system. That could be tricky.
Yeah.
But again, that's like treating the symptom and not the cause. And so I often tell parents and therapists, like, you have to go back and look at what's driving that, which, depending on their anxiety or OCD theme, could be so many different things.
Mm.
If it's separation anxiety, or if it's OCD related to contamination, or if it's social anxiety or perfectionism, all those things are going to look different. But a lot of times there can be tweaks that can happen in the school environment that will actually reduce that anxiety and then reduce that school refusal, because there's been some solutions there.
Right. So, yeah, so do you think that assessing the root anxiety, whether it's, OCD or um, social anxiety or separation anxiety, or maybe academic, like school performance anxiety, then determines the kind of exposure that the adults can help kids gradually experience? Is that right? Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Yeah,
Mhm.
because if it's social anxiety and going to school is just so overwhelming, could they do some social anxiety exposures outside of school? Could they order their own food? Could they join an online club? Like, there's other smaller steps that can acclimate them before they go back into that big, overwhelming environment. With
Yeah.
separation anxiety, which is a really common one, even for middle schoolers, could they work on that at home? Could the mom go, you know, to Starbucks and they have to, sit with the discomfort of not knowing when mom's going to be back? Or, you could do exposures
Yeah.
outside of school and build the muscle, because a lot of times school is like, it's like the Super Bowl of exposure, and so sometimes it's too big and they have to build up those skills and those steps before they get there.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I sometimes think about, like a fear hierarchy and exposure ladder. Um, and so going to school, just like walking in the door, could be the top, very, very top of the ladder for a kid, like the Super
Right.
Bowl. So how to determine those steps underneath can be really challenging. Yeah, it's such a complicated problem. And as I've looked at it recently, just in the literature, it's really uh, it's often very intractable. Like once that those avoidance behaviors begin, it's really hard to help a child overcome them. What are your sort of first steps as the outside there? And often that's what would happen too in a school. School would say, well, you have to get her here or him, and so that we could help. And then if parents can't get the child to school, they'll seek an outside therapist. Ideally, the school psychologist or school counselor could partner with that person, but that doesn't always happen. As if you get a referral like that for a child who's not able to go to school, what are kind of your first steps?
Once they've already not gone to school and they're already kind of entrenched in school avoidance, that's so much harder than a child that is sporadically going to school, and then you can really partner with the school and you can figure out what those core fears are. And you can set up accommodations, whether it's formalized or informal, that take off that stress while you are working on it. And so there might be accommodations that are kind of feeding the anxiety a bit because it's avoidant, but then the outside therapist can start doing exposures and working on it, and they're still going to school. When
Yeah.
they're not at school at all, first you have to figure out what the core fear or fears are, and that takes a little bit of work because sometimes kids either don't know themselves or not forthcoming. They just don't want to go. And so that takes some detective work. But there's
Yeah.
always a core fear that's driving it underneath. Sometimes it's not related to school. Sometimes it's just leaving the house or being separated from the parent. And school just happens to be one other environment where they are exposed to whatever their core fear is. Emetophobia, the fear of throw up. I would say
Right.
emetophobia, the fear of throw up, and separation anxiety and social anxiety are like the top three, that I see at least
Yeah.
that cause some school refusal. So working on that with each child as far as what can you do in the home environment or around the home environment to build up those muscles. And that will look different depending on what we're talking about.
Right. And it's so interesting to me that emetophobia is so common because it makes so much sense, especially when a child is feeling a lot of somatic anxiety and it makes
Mhm.
them nauseous. Like it's so, I find sometimes kids don't even have the words to describe that fear. It takes a while to even slow it down enough, in a conversation. Um, like that detective work piece can take so long because kids they don't really, like, it's not like they're thinking, I'm really afraid I'm going to throw up and that would be so terrible, so I'm just not going to go. It's like not as sometimes not that conscious. Is that right? Do you notice that as well?
Yeah, I think with the emetophobia, they know they don't want to be around throw up, or they know they don't want to throw up. I think they might have an hard time articulating what the core fear is, because that the core fear of emetophobia could be different. It might be embarrassment of losing control in front of other people. It might be the fear of the pain. The core fears can be different. But yeah, I think that a lot of kids with emetophobia, especially, have a hard time with school because you're right. Like there's that anticipatory anxiety that causes that physiological response to have a stomach ache. And so in the morning, you're going to feel like your stomach is sour. So it's just ripe for a problem. And then having to go in front of peers where you are exposed if you lost control is super overwhelming. And then people get sick at school and there's a nurse's office. So there's so many layers that can cause struggles. The other thing I'd say is when it's OCD, and emetophobia can go either way.
Right.
Sometimes with OCD, just talking about it, I've worked with kids with the emetophobia where I would categorize it as OCD and they couldn't say the word throw up. They couldn't say the word vomit, and exposure started with just communicating the words. And so to even sit down and say, tell me why you're afraid of throwing up, or, you know,
Right.
that could get them to run out of the room because they're hearing the word that they're not, that's almost like contaminated. They can't hear that word.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I just feel for them because I get the sense of how uncomfortable it can be for them to get to that point to be able to say the words. Yeah, and so that makes me think one of the hardest challenges, even if kids are sometimes able to get to school, if they're in that kind of gray zone where it's really uncomfortable, but they're not always absent or always avoiding school or refusing school, um, that to get, especially depending on how old they are, to get their buy-in for taking some small steps towards their fear, whether it's saying a word or um, and anything small, like, just kind of not doing safety behaviors or whatever it is, while they're in their classroom. How do you talk to kids about what's happening if it is, let's say, OCD, and they're really uncomfortable and they're not able to articulate it, and yet part of the plan would be to do the detective work to try to understand, and then get them to get a little bit more comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah, anxiety and OCD, like how I explain it to kids and how I talk about it with kids are very different because they're different parts of the brain. I think a lot of times we think OCD is part of anxiety. OCD can feel very anxiety producing, but it's, it's two separate worlds. And so I don't think there's a lot of people who understand that. And kids certainly don't understand that because they are um, you know, they're kids.
Yeah.
So explaining how OCD works beforehand, because OCD is very shifty and it can get kids to think like, I can't speak about this. If I speak about it, it's going to get worse. Anxious kids can feel that way too. They just feel like it makes me anxious to talk about. OCD is really a compulsion. Like I can't speak this or
Yeah.
it will happen. And so we talked about when you were introducing me, with anxiety, I talk about the lifeguard and it's like this overreactive amygdala, really, that is protecting you, but he's just, he's not great at his job and he just freaks out a lot and he's trying to look out for you, but he's struggling. So we have to train him. We have to retrain him to bring it down a notch and to only respond to true emergencies.
Yeah.
OCD totally different. It's the basal ganglia and the circuitry of the brain. And so it has more to do with things getting stuck. And so I explain that to kids first. You're getting thoughts and feelings that get stuck and they're not going through the proper channels to get unstuck. And so instead, your brain is saying, okay, we have to do this compulsion. We have to keep doing this compulsion. And it grows because you're stuck on this loop. So
Yeah.
getting kids to understand that. And one of those things that are getting stuck is you not even being able to speak about this. And so they, teaching them what a compulsion is, that you get an intrusive thought or feeling, and then you have the need to do or avoid something to get that brief relief. But the more you do that or avoid that, the bigger the OCD grows. And getting them to see this loop and what part of this is a loop is really the first step before I do anything else, before I even talk about exposures, because people have to understand that and why they're going to pull back and not scratch that itch before they can even do that.
Yeah. Yeah. That can take a lot of time because of how uncomfortable it is for them to want to engage in that understanding or that discussion in the first place, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Um so when you're explaining to kids either retraining the lifeguard and if it's anxiety, what are you looking for as you're doing the detective work to distinguish, especially when it's not clear, what to distinguish between anxiety and, like let's just say I'm super uncomfortable with, you know, uh, going into the cafeteria. So I avoid it. I use the restroom, I hang out in the locker, or I hang out in my class, talk to my teachers, I get extra help. How do you start to, what kinds of questions do you ask to determine whether maybe there's some OCD there? Like maybe it's, germophobia or like, or the food might be rotten or whatever.
Yeah. It's a good question because a lot of times we don't know what we're starting with. And so I normally say things like, what's the hardest part about going into the cafeteria? Just already validating that it's hard, but what is the hardest part about it? And
Yeah.
then they normally, if they're willing to talk at all, right? Because sometimes you're not going to break that barrier to do more rapport building or whatever, but let's just pretend we had a more open, articulate child.
Yeah.
They may not know. And so they might say, they're going to give you an answer that's still pretty high up, the rabbit hole. And so they might say, it just smells really gross. And that normally their first answer is kind of like, okay, it's a string that you're going to pull,
Right.
And so then I might explore that and I might say, well, tell me more about that. Like what smells the grossest? Well, everybody's lunches really smell gross. And so now I'm like thinking, okay, is this a sensory issue or is this an OCD disgust issue? Just to give you an example of an OCD theme.
Yeah.
And they might say, and so then I might ask something like, so when you're sitting there and you feel like things smell gross, what would be the hardest part about that? And so then they might say, well, the smell might get on my clothes, and then my clothes will smell, and then I won't be able to get that smell off, and then I won't be able to sit on my couch when I get home. I'll have to change my clothes because my clothes have to go in the wash. Now we are knee deep in contamination OCD.
Right.
And so that would be a very different response from what's the worst part about going to the cafeteria? Well, when I walk in late, everybody stares at me,
Right.
and then I don't know who I can sit with. And then my friends are all talking, but they're not including me. Now we're like moving more towards social anxiety. So
Yeah.
these questions are like little data points that start to lead you over here or over there.
Right. Yeah. I wish there was like a decision tree for some of these questions where you could just be like, oh, nope, now I'm going to turn right and go down this row. Because, yeah, it is such detective work. And there's like an infinite variety of responses to all of that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I noticed also one of the things that I really appreciated that I just saw you recently share about, I think, a Facebook or Instagram was training parents with the space program. It's like a course that you have currently, right? And so I've been trying to learn as much as I can through the textbook, through Eli Leibowitz's textbook on space and his parent focused book, his sort of the popular book about
Mhm.
out from anxiety, about the space program, because I feel as though a lot of times these challenges with working directly with the kids are so steep that it would be really helpful if we could have an adult focused intervention change the adult behavior to help the child in schools. And I know
Mhm.
that's not spaces for parents, but what do you think about that? Have you ever worked with school adults at school on sort of reducing accommodations once you have done the detective work and you kind of know what's going on?
I think it'd be great for people to be educated about the space program in the school environment, because you want to take if there's a therapist outside working with a child, you'd want to take their lead as far as when you're pulling back accommodations. But even just basic education about how sometimes doing things for anxiety and OCD will feed it. I did a presentation a while ago, a couple of years ago, for it was teachers and maybe some counselors were sprinkled in. It was like a school district.
Yeah.
And one teacher, I won't ever forget this because I was kind of like, one teacher, and she was, good intentions, but she would, she raised her hand and she was like, I have OCD and I had a student who has OCD and I totally get how it feels. And so I made sure to clean all the buckets out before they had to touch them. And I would like move them, so that she didn't have to touch, she did all this accommodation. And I had to gently be like, you might want to talk to the mom or the therapist about that, because that may not be how we want to approach it. And it is a sticky situation because, like I said before, sometimes we want those accommodations. Accommodations is a positive word typically in the school environment.
Right.
And it's used in a totally different way when it comes to the OCD and anxiety world. And the space program is about removing accommodations
Yeah.
systematically.
Right.
But it's when you're a part of the loop. It's empowering the child to be able to sit with the discomfort or to really detangle yourself from a compulsion. But I have worked with kids. I mean, I had worked with a boy that couldn't go to school and he didn't like the communal supplies. He had contamination OCD, and it was either he wasn't going to go to school at all, or there could be some brief accommodations for him to have separate school supplies.
Sure.
And so sometimes you have to do those things. So I think it'd be a little sticky as far as just having the school run with, okay, these accommodations aren't good, let's pull them back, when sometimes they're necessary to get them to get to school. But then you might have a teacher who's inadvertently feeding it. Like if you have moral OCD, you have a child who they confess things that they've done that they think they've done that they haven't done. And I've worked with kids, they'll confess to the teacher, I think I cheated, or I saw the answers, or I was the one that hit him, and they didn't do it. And when the teacher, it, it takes that at face value and then responds in a way that is either punitive, that's not good,
Mhm.
or, you didn't do that. I saw you. You didn't even get up. And I don't even have the answers on my desk, so you couldn't have seen them. That's
Yeah,
actually an accommodation. It's completing the loop. It's
right.
giving that reassurance. So it gets very tricky.
Very tricky. Yeah, and such a good point too that the way we typically use the word accommodations in school is such a good thing. And
Yeah.
what we're talking about here is not accommodating the anxiety versus still accommodating the child in any ways that we can to support their progress. Um, yeah, it's really hard. Yeah, it would be really great if um, the space program could be adapted for teachers to understand, just even just the mechanism of reassurance or making more room for the anxiety and like different mechanisms, I guess, because there could be so many. um, with social anxiety in particular, I can see how, teachers could potentially accommodate anxiety by, maybe not calling on a child that they know is like anxious or, shy or has a hard time um, participating in class. And so if that teacher knew that it was social anxiety and a child was like now in class, which might be a big step, um, how could a teacher gradually pull back on some of the accommodations that they may do out of like concern and care and protection, um, without pulling back too quickly?
I don't know. I don't know. It makes me nervous to think of the school doing space
Yeah.
because I feel like it's normally the other problem. It's normally the teacher's not sympathetic, or the teacher is randomly calling on them. And I almost feel like the parent or the outside therapist would communicate with the school if you had a teacher who was over accommodating. But I feel like it's just so much the other way that typically the school under accommodates kids with anxiety and OCD. And to get them to school, like I said, the school is like the Super Bowl of struggles. And so um, that environment might need to be cushy to get them to school and to stay in school so they can focus on their academics and actually do well in school. I think a parent would probably reach out and say, stop don't wash my child's bucket, or, something like that.
Yeah.
I think that's rare. I think the opposite, because kids with anxiety or OCD are often, really good students. They are the wallflowers. They don't rock the boat. They're not noticed. And a lot of times parents face resistance when they bring their struggles to the school because the school will say, we don't see it.
Yeah.
Um, they look like they have straight A's. We don't see them struggling. And the parent is dealing with hours and hours of meltdowns at home due to homework or due to getting them to school.
Mm.
Um, and that becomes the bigger issue, is how to get anxiety and OCD recognized when you have this quasi model student that looks like they're holding it all together.
Yes, for sure. And it makes me think too of something that I wonder about. I see a lot of perfectionism in kids with anxiety, and sometimes knowing if that perfectionism is like might be OCD could be really hard because are they spending 3 hours on their, writing assignment because they're just anxious about doing it really well, or are they, writing it over and over again because the letters have to be a certain way, um or are there rituals involved in homework that just make it take so long that's hard to know? And that I think that kind of anxiety or OCD is so tricky too, because the rituals and the compulsions are often sort of internal, right? They're I mean, I guess um they're behavioral, but they're hard to see. They're not like you could just if you watch the child, they might just look like they just really care about their homework.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think perfectionism and just right OCD often get mislabeled, because a child who's perfectionistic wants to do well, and sometimes doesn't want to perform because they don't know if they can, and I think most people watching this or listening to this will understand what perfectionism is. Just right OCD looks like perfectionism, but it's driven with a completely different mechanism. It just doesn't feel right. So they have to write and write until it feels just right. But it never, ever really reaches that point where it does. And so you have these kids erasing and rewriting, or even asking a question over and over until it feels just right in their mouth, or they hear what you need to say. And so they look like they have processing issues. I've worked with kids that have to read and reread until the words feel right. Or if they don't know a word, they have to reread it again. Or if they feel like they mispronounced a word, or they have compulsions in math where they have to, you know, count certain numbers or skip certain numbers or until it feels just right, or other OCD themes. And so they can look like learning struggles, or they can look like a child's really striving really hard. And so we might say, your grade doesn't matter. And that really is not speaking to their issue, because it's more about it just didn't feel right.
Yeah. Yes. That's a really tricky thing to tease out, to understand, because again, it goes back to that detective work, to really kind of ask the questions about what's happening when you're, doing your work and it's taking so long. Like,
Yeah.
what is that like for you? And yeah. Do you think you could, well, maybe I could give you a kind of de-identified mix-up compilation of a kid, and ask you kind of where you might start. I'm thinking of a like one of those students that you mentioned that teachers don't really notice because they're so sweet and follow all the rules, and they get great grades, they're doing everything that they need to be doing, and they have some kind of like internal struggle, whether it's for example, I know kids who just won't use the bathroom all day because maybe they're afraid of germs in the bathroom, or yeah, usually that. And so then they won't drink water all day. They go through
Mhm.
kind of extremes to make that happen. Where might you start with a kid like that? If, like, let's say they go to the school counselor because, if they have to go, they tend to go to the nurse to ask to go home or something like that. And this is happening a lot, and people know something's up, but they're not sure what. Where might you start, or what would you recommend to either parents or the school team?
You want to figure out what the core fear is. I'm all about the core fear, because it could be anything. It could be social anxiety. They don't want to pee or poop in front of anybody.
Yeah.
That's a really common one too. And you're right about the restriction, right? They won't eat, they won't drink. It becomes really dangerous depending on where you live. They get dehydrated. And so I think it's asking, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but you elaborate. But the core question is, what's the hardest part about going to the bathroom?
Right.
And if they say it's gross, or, I don't want to get sick, or there's people in there, then we know we're moving more towards a contamination issue, which could be for all sorts of reasons beyond germs. Or if they say, I don't want anyone to hear me, pee, or what if I have to poop? That's going to look like a totally different type of accommodation for the child versus the OCD one. And so with OCD, when it's a disgust thing, whether it's germs or disgust, or, whatever is making it contaminated, we might start outside of the school, because again, school is kind of ground zero for grossness, and so it's going to be super hard to be like, let's just start doing exposures at school. So I
Right.
often recommend that parents start doing exposure. Sometimes they can't even go to the bathroom at home. I've worked with a lot of parents who will say, Natasha, they're not drinking at school, and they'll hold their pee in all day long. And I'll
Yeah.
say, well, what's it like at home? And they're like, oh, it takes forever. And I'm like, okay, well, if they can't even go at home, we
Right.
have to start at home, because school is going to be a bigger hill to climb. So working on doing exposures around their home toilet, and then it might be, well, grandma's toilet's not perfectly clean, but it's not as comfortable as home, but it's not as bad as school. So now we're making this hierarchy of, let's do some exposures around that. So you're
Yeah.
building your way up. If it's social anxiety, you can do more accommodation oriented things just to get that child to drink and be healthy And so it might be a conversation of, would you feel more comfortable going into the nurse's office? Could you have a pass on you that you always carry, that you could just always go to the nurse? And that might reduce their anxiety like 90% because they
Okay.
have a safe place to go.
Yeah. Yeah. See the progression there. Um, from, starting at home to grandma's to maybe, yeah, just trying to make it just incrementally harder. And how would you talk to a child about that? Like, how would you get them to say, okay, I'm gonna try this?
Well, I have to go all the way back. So normally I personify it if the child's open to it. So we might call it Mr. Bossy or Mr. O, and
Yeah.
so we externalize it just to protect their self-esteem and see it as something that they're crushing.
Sure.
And we might say, Mr. O. And normally it's not just one theme. Often it shows up in multitude of areas. And so, we might talk about how Mr. O is like telling you not to drink at school and telling you that you can't use the bathroom. And you want to get the child or teenager, young adult even, to see, how is this impacting you? So instead of kind of doing things to the child, it's, what's the hardest part about this? What's your biggest struggle? If you didn't have Mr. O, what would be better? What would life look like?
Yeah.
So kind of more of like an ACT approach of getting them to kind of identify what OCD is taking away from them. Well, it's really hard because I'm uncomfortable and I miss lunch because everybody's eating and drinking and it makes me uncomfortable. So I just, walk around and I skip it and then I don't get to talk to my friends. And so they start to identify why it's a problem, because if they don't see it as a problem, or if we don't highlight, where they can see it as a problem, they're not going to be motivated to work on it. So
Sure.
that would be the first step. And then I talk about the mechanisms of OCD. The more you give into Mr. O, the bigger he grows, the more he'll demand. And so they start to see this in their life. And then the third component is incentivizing. And so, creating a behavior modification program really helps with anxiety or OCD. And I often talk about it being bravery points. I'm not bribing you to do something, but I'm acknowledging that this is brave of you. I'm asking you to touch, the floor of the bathroom. That's brave of you because Mr. O is screaming at you that this is life threatening. And
Yeah.
so we're going to acknowledge that, and we're going to incentivize it with bravery points or some sort of incentive program
Sure.
to help motivate them and get them to walk towards that cliff, because otherwise it's too scary.
Absolutely. Yeah. And those kinds of reinforcement plans and schedules, I think school psychologists really can wrap their minds around so
Yeah.
that, yeah, because maybe once to at the point where the child is able to be in school, maybe some of that in partnership with the therapist could continue. They could earn bravery points at school that could go home, or the school could have, rewards to, like, whatever, mystery prize box or something like that.
Yeah. Super
Yeah.
helpful. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my goodness. There's just so many kiddos that could, use this kind of specialized understanding and support, and not enough people to go around that can help, but that understand. What are your main suggestions for parents as they're beginning the journey to understand their child, whether the child is exhibiting symptoms, signs of anxiety or OCD?
It's really helpful to have your own baseline understanding of anxiety and OCD. So, finding resources to understand. Anxiety is not as rocket sciencey. It's like, I think we all get anxiety on some level, but some people miss the themes and things that show up. If your child is showing signs of OCD, or if you don't even know because you don't know outside of the stereotypical version of OCD, just educating yourself, because a child who has anxiety is more at risk of having a comorbid condition like OCD. And so that's what I always tell parents. The first step is educating, because not even every therapist will understand how to treat OCD. So if you don't understand what you're looking at with your child, you're not going to even be able to get to the right kind of treatment.
Sure. Yeah, that's true. And we would hope that if you do land with a therapist who isn't, who understands this is OCD and also then doesn't have the training or the experience to be effective in treating it, that they would refer you out, hopefully. That doesn't always, sometimes doesn't, isn't the case. Yeah. Yeah. So what has been, I'm just going to ask you about your work a little bit. What has been kind of the most fulfilling parts of this journey with AT parenting for you?
Nobody's ever asked me that. I don't know. I think, I get a lot of messages from people globally, who will say, we've been to so many therapists and no therapist ever identified this as OCD. And now that we know what it is, we're with the right therapist and we're getting the right treatment and they're doing so much better. I think that's the best feeling. There's also parents who don't have access to treatment, and whether it's because it's cost prohibitive, or the child's not wanting to go, or they're in a location where there just are no anxiety or OCD therapists, especially OCD therapists. And the other thing that's really rewarding is just seeing the progress. And I have a support group too, so I can kind of like see the kids and I can watch them evolve, and that's very, very cool. But
Yeah.
for parents to say, because sometimes I'll think that, wow, their therapist is just really knocking it out of the park, like they're doing really well. And I remember one time this mom was just like, we don't see a therapist. The only thing he's getting is the support group and the stuff I'm learning from you. And I was just blown away because he's just making so much progress. So yeah, I think that's the most rewarding thing for sure.
Yeah. It sounds rewarding. And I bet, particularly when you're doing space with parents and they really get that and have internalized it, and they're making changes to what they control and feeling empowered, seeing the progress that their child is then making, that feels really good. Like that feels really hopeful. Um, I know Dr. Leibowitz, I reached out to him not too long ago to ask him about schools, and he said it's something to keep on the lookout for, that he too has been thinking about schools. And
Okay, that's a good sign.
yeah, so that's very exciting. So we should all stay posted for that. But I think the space program itself is so hopeful because adults focused intervention um, is so much more, manageable for us
Mhm.
adults. So, what have you found in working with space and parents in your AT parenting community? How's that going? And is that one of your favorite ways to work with parents, or do you prefer working with children directly, or a mix of both?
I'm not working with kids directly except for my support group, and I'm just moderating. I'm not really working with them as a therapist.
Okay.
Um, I feel like space is one small component. I'm connecting them to resources. I'm really tapping into my social work groups. Like I'm getting them to find the right therapist, and I'm getting them to pull back through, space, pull back their involvement in their child's anxiety and OCD. And then I'm giving them tools to also help their kids at home, because there's proactive things they can do, and mindset of like, you're only one piece of the puzzle. I think the hard thing is that intuitively, it's a normal parental instinct to go and try to rescue your kids. We don't want to see our kids struggle. And so it's in our DNA to go and swoop in to when they're distressed. And with OCD, they're distressed, and we know that if we just do this one thing, that will decrease the stress. And so it seems very intuitive to say, they want me to repeat this word, like, what's the big deal? Let me just repeat it. Or they want me to kiss the other side of their cheek before they go to bed. And yeah, it's an hour process, but then they can sleep better. So what's the big deal? So getting them to understand, one, why it's a big deal, how it's growing those neural pathways. And then you have to deal with the guilt that comes afterwards of, oh my gosh, I didn't know I was growing those neural pathways. And now I feel like I'm causing damage. And you're like, it didn't happen overnight. And that's what I like about Ellie Leibowitz's space program is it's systematic. And so it's like, just take one bite, one piece of the puzzle, and we're just going to systematically detangle you from the anxiety and OCD while empowering your child. That's the other component, though, that space doesn't cover, is if you have a willing participant, which sometimes you do, then we want to do the empowering and collaborating with that child as we're pulling back.
Sure. Yeah. So, and do you mean like with the child's own therapy or therapist?
A lot of times they don't have a therapist.
Okay.
In my community, I would say maybe 1/3 have therapists because they are either in a region that doesn't have therapy, or I deal with a lot of parents of kids who have OCD. And so they know that a regular therapist, unless they specialize in ERP, that they're probably not going to be an effective therapist for OCD. And so they're all, a lot of them are doing it themselves,
Okay.
um, and then eventually get connected. That's the hope, at least.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So much to think about in this age of anxiety, so many layers of thinking through how we adults can most help our kiddos and our um, students and communities. I know we're coming close to the end of time, and I don't want to keep you past your generous time tonight, but I do want to just ask you if you have any, things that you definitely wanted to share with either school psychologists or parents that you haven't yet addressed.
I think school psychologists are in a position to really help on such a deep level, because that's normally where the parent and the child are feeling the most stress, when it comes to the world of anxiety and OCD, is getting them to school, getting them to stay in school. And more often than not, I feel like parents feel like they have to tackle this big beast by themselves, and they're so overwhelmed. And so having this understanding that a child won't look like they're on fire if they are internally on fire, and that when it's anxiety and OCD, it's just as acute as, a child with bipolar or ADHD or dyslexia. That just because the child's holding it all together and looks like a model student doesn't mean that they aren't struggling as intensely, if not more intensely.
Yeah, so true. Yeah. I also noticed that you have on your website upcoming parent trainings and workshops. Where can people find out where you are? Do you have professional trainings as well for school psychologists or school clinicians?
I don't. I've been asked to speak a few times, so I'll come and I'll do a training. It's I don't really have a lot of like ongoing trainings. I have an online school,
Okay.
and they're on demand courses, and sometimes teachers and school counselors will take those, because just you can see it as a parent, because it's talking to the parent.
Okay.
But yeah, I don't.
Oh, well, maybe you could consider that.
Yeah, it's a good
Yeah.
population to work with for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Um, and and I encourage everyone out there, check out the YouTube channel, and the videos are so helpful just for your language and your compassion and your warmth really come through. And so just modeling after the way you are talking to people who are struggling, young people, is really helpful just to kind of observe and absorb. I've learned a lot from you, as I said when we were off air, but I really am grateful to you because I feel like I've learned a lot from just watching your work. And so thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your journey. And thank you so much for being on the podcast tonight. And to our live audience, I'm sorry if you're comment. I don't see any questions or comments. I think I would, but if you have any, put them in the chat and I'll get them in our last minute. But otherwise, keep them coming over time. I'll look back at the video, and if you have questions for Natasha that we didn't cover tonight, I can send her an email and see if she will give us something that I could post as an answer. But Natasha, thank you so much for being here and talking to School Psych Podcast and school psychologists out there. We appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate that.
Okay. Everyone, have a wonderful night. Hopefully, you have tomorrow off. I think it's a long weekend for some people. And if not, have a wonderful, meaningful day at work. And we'll see you in 2 weeks for our next episode. Good night, everybody.